To give you guys some context on how long it's been since seasons, Stranger Things 3 came out pre-COVID, July 2019. That was a fun time. There was a lot of stuff coming out at that moment. It was really awesome. And now Stranger Things 4 is coming out almost 3 years later and after a whole pandemic. Well, pandemic's still going. So, yeah. But this is only volume 1. Episodes 1 to 7 are now available to stream. Episodes 8 and 9 will be out on July 1st. And those are because episode 9 is apparently 2.5 hours long. And there's a huge season finale for this thing, which is going to lead into the final season. And so this is essentially the beginning of the end. I was very excited for this season. I've loved all 3 seasons, honestly. I know there's some detrimental opinions when it comes to the other 2 seasons, the other sequel seasons, and yes, they have their issues, but I was always fascinated with the story and the potential of what the Upside Down can create in terms of trouble for our main characters. And so going into season 4, I didn't actually see the trailer, so I had no idea what the thread they're dealing with this time would be, but I was interested in figuring out what it was. Of course, things have changed since the events of season 3. Some of our characters are now living in another part of the country, and so there's a lot of split situations that are going on as a result of it. But since it is the break, now a lot of them are meeting up and they're taking flights to one another, but eventually things have to come to a halt in terms of fun because there might be trouble brewing on the horizon. And so in that case, they have to band together once again to take on whatever creature is haunting the place. There are dire circumstances, however, when it comes to Stranger Things 4. For one, Eleven doesn't have her powers anymore. If you remember, things got really screwed up in season 3, and so she's just an ordinary person for the moment. And so she has to sort of work out a way to bring those powers back. As a result of that, our characters are in a much more desperate situation now because they can't rely on her to basically shut things down with a nosebleed at best. Since that's not an option anymore, they have to sort of rely on their wit and skills that they've picked up over the last few encounters with upside down creatures and hopefully take on this new villain that has arisen. And we'll talk more about the new villain in a second. But one of the things that I really like out the gate was that vibe. There is a much more scary and daunting horror-esque feel to this season that feels a little more in line with season 1. Season 2 and 3, they started to get a lot more fun, which is also fine, but it took away a little bit from the creepy aspect of it. And eventually, when the stuff that was creepy did happen, especially in season 3, it was like, that was great, but it also went back to the neon lights and the mall stuff and the fun colors, and that's all good and all. But you also want to stay in line with what this show was meant to be in the first place, and season 4 understands that. It goes back to that. And it leads to the most tense season, I would say, of the 4. It definitely feels like it goes full-blown horror at times. It's definitely the goriest in many ways. There's some very gnarly deaths that you see, and it very much embraces things like Nightmare on Elm Street because it does feel like this was a sequel to Nightmare on Elm Street. It plays out like a stealth sequel in a lot of ways. It also doesn't help that our main villain is voiced by Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger, so it just feels like a full circle thing at this point. But like I said, it does put our characters in a more vulnerable position because in a lot of ways, season 4 deals with consequences. The villain that is after them, Vecna, is all after targets who have done something and they've been involved in something that they could have had control over in terms of rectifying, but they didn't really do a good job of it. And so the victims that he's claiming are people who he believes should repent and should suffer for that. And so they die in some horrific ways. And some of that includes characters that we may know. One of the targets eventually becomes Max, played by Sadie Sink once again. I'll talk more about Max in a bit, but the kind of thing that's happening with this character is incredibly fascinating. And I think in a lot of ways, Vecna is the most interesting villain that the Stranger Things show has ever had. I really liked this really creepy, tense vibe and really awful things like he can do when he sees through into you and is like, hey, that thing that you think that you're sorry about and you could have fixed, you didn't really do a good job of it, and so you should like pay for this. Kind of acts like a spirit of vengeance of sorts. And the performance is genuinely remarkable. The effects on Vecna are genuinely terrifying. And eventually the origin story that you get, which again I'm going into in a bit, is really great. The performances are honestly all phenomenal. Millie Bobby Brown once again kills it as 11. Finn Wolfhard, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, Sadie Sink, all of them are terrific. But I do want to give a special shout to Sadie Sink because I think she is the real gem of this season. She is absolutely brilliant, and she does such a great job in some of the episodes, especially episode 4, which is essentially all about her. When she realizes that she's a target for Vecna, she's trying to wrap up anything that she can in order to make amends and hopefully leave, in a way that sort of is better. Like, at least some things have been rectified. And that leads to some emotional moments and some really tense moments when eventually Vecna comes for her, and she ends up in the Upside Down with Vecna, very close to actually getting killed. And the kind of love and compassion that comes through, which helps save her, especially in the form of a Kate Bush song. It was really great with that level of depth added to her character, and she performed the absolute bejesus out of this season. She is absolutely brilliant, and I can't wait to see what she does in the next few episodes. I also have to give a big shout out to the other cast members, Natalia Dyer, Maya Hawke, who's once again really entertaining as Robin. But it's also great seeing our two main leads in this who are credited in the opening, Winona Ryder and David Harbour, as Joyce and Hopper once again. They're both really fun characters, and honestly, every time you see Winona Ryder or David Harbour in something, most times it's like a win, and it's just great seeing them. They're awesome actors. And obviously, Hopper is still alive. Feel like we've covered that this is going to be a spoiler review in the title of this video, but nonetheless, obviously Hopper survived the events of season 3 and he's being held in a Russian prison. Now, this is a subplot of the show that sometimes does get a little overdrawn out because Joyce is trying to find Hopper, and eventually that leads her and Murray down a wild goose chase of sorts trying to get to him, which involves ransom, some KGB offers, and all that stuff. And it's interesting, but it's also the part of the season where you're like, wow, this is really going on a little longer than I thought it would. Like, it is a huge chunk of the runtime. And yeah, for the most part, I would say it was interesting, but then there were parts where it wasn't quite as interesting. The back half of the storyline, which involves them going to this prison and eventually you encountering that Demogorgon that you saw in season 3, that was by far the most interesting segment of it. The first bit involving trying to break out and then not going super well was interesting, but not nearly as fun or exciting as I think the back half was. But I really liked it nonetheless. All the characters are in their own trips because some characters have to deal with the fact that there is a conspiracy by the government to try and take them out. There's one part of it which is trying to save Max and eventually cover up for this one guy named Eddie, who seems to be the culprit in terms of a lot of these killings because he was in that spot. There's Eleven, who's trying to get her powers back and eventually realizes that her father, Dr. Brenner, played once again by Matthew Modine, is still alive. And so they're working in a bunker trying to unlock some memories. And then there's also the Joyce Hopper subplot where they're trying to get him out of a Russian prison. Now, all of that combined can get stuffy, which is why the extended episode times are there. This is all an hour and a half each at least. So if you come to episode 3 and you feel like you've seen way too much TV, it's because it's been 4.5 hours and you might need to take a break. That's totally fine. I had to, because otherwise I would have had this review up yesterday. But it's a very dense season as a result of that. They've packed in a lot here, and I'm not surprised to learn that the season finale is going to be 2.5 hours long, because there's so much yet that they have yet to answer, and there's so much to cover. And I think that for the most part at least, I think they managed to keep things as comprehensible as possible. But I do think sometimes it feels a little underdeveloped in terms of a couple of other things, like some characters don't get enough chances to shine as a result of it, and some of them really are, they're put to the back burner. And that maybe is my only major issue with this entire season. I was way more interested in the Vecna stuff and stuff that's happening in Hawkins, which I think is going to be most viewers. But nonetheless, like I said, it keeps it going for the most part. But the big reveal of the season is obviously built on what is Vecna? Who is Vecna? Who is this vessel of sorts? Like, we've never seen this guy before. And the origin story that you eventually get for Vecna, which comes in the form of one of the other kids who was at the facility with Eleven, is really interesting. Obviously, this is the very end of Volume 1, but you get this reveal as to who Vecna is, and it turns out to be one, the first patient. And he's incredibly powerful, and he gets thrown into the Upside Down after he basically leads a massacre of the lab that you believe is 11 for the most part of the season at first, but eventually 11 chucks him into the Upside Down and he becomes this monster of sorts. And I think that's an interesting story. The way they handled that was really, really cool. And it makes things a lot more personal because 1 and 11 had a very special relationship in that he was an orderly at the lab who did want 11 to get out of there. And he was like, listen, what they're doing to you guys in here, they're lying. You need to get out of this lab right now. And I want to help you get out of here. And eventually that bond that builds between them, it feels weird because you're trying to figure out what this guy really is all about at the end of the day. And then eventually when you start to get some reveals, it makes things a lot more interesting. Being able to tap into their thoughts and essentially expose their deepest, darkest secrets and essentially making them repent for that. I already talked about it earlier in the review, but it added so much thematic depth to it. There's also a subplot with a bunch of basketballers who are being led by the captain of their team. His girlfriend is one of the victims, the first victim of the season, in fact. And he is very certain that this Eddie guy, who is part of a D&D club, the Hellfire Club, is responsible for it. And eventually, because D&D was kind of considered like a satanic cult thing at one point in time in the 80s, boy, they were essentially being able to draw this thing like, hey, they're doing this thing. It seems like fun and games, but really it's about the devil and we need to unite and stop this thing. It's eventually going to result in, obviously, a moment of clarity for this guy because he's going to see the truth and be like, oh my god, it turns out monsters are real. At which point he'd probably die, because that's usually how this goes, or he's going to become a convert and start helping the other kids in their process to stop Vecna. But as of right now, that whole thing is just another thing that didn't necessarily need to be there. And even the kids are like, come on, man, we don't need to deal with this shit. And so it's almost self-aware and like, we don't need this plot. But it's in there to add some extra tension to the fact that the authorities are after the kids, and that makes situations that they're dealing with a lot more tense. I said tense. But I do want to talk about a little bit about the technical aspects of this season, because it is reported that apparently $30 million per episode is the cost for this, which brings the total cost of the entire season when episodes 8 and 9 come out to $270 million, which is crazy. But you can see the money on the screen. The Stranger Things series has never looked visually better than it does right now. It's gorgeous to look at. The cinematography is exquisite. The sound design is impeccable. Like, really, aside from maybe a couple of shots, this is a very good looking season. And credit is to be given to all the VFX artists involved. They've really taken the time over these last couple of years, almost 3 now, to develop something that is genuinely spectacular to look at. Much better than some blockbusters that I've seen in recent times. I mean, it is really remarkable how far TV has come as a medium over the last few years. And the music choices are once again phenomenal. Like I said, the acting is all really, really great. It's tension filled. It's got some horrifying moments, but I'm very interested in seeing how they wrap it up, which is why I'm not sure if I should give it a grade yet. Because it's not like a part 1, part 2 of a movie. A part 1 of a movie has a beginning, middle, and an end. That's that movie. And it then leads into the next one, which has its own other story to tell. In this case, we're still in the middle of season 4 with volume 1. So volume 2 isn't out yet. So it doesn't feel right to give a final grade on a season until we're fully done with it. But overall, I'm very satisfied with what's going on so far. And it's a lot to process. I'm still sort of running it over in my head, but hopefully it ends well. And then when season 4 part 2, volume 2 comes out, I'll give a final grade to it. So guys, what about volume 1 so far? What are your thoughts on it? Do you think it's as good as the other seasons? Do you think it's not as good? Leave them in the comments below, let me know. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe. Thank you very much for watching as always, and I'll see you guys at the movies.